Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
Okay, our next panel will talk about local capacity. We'll invite back Paul Galzewski and Jamil Nakvi from the LAO, and also invite up Jeff Vaca, Deputy Executive Director for Governmental Relations from the California Association for School Business Officials, and Richard Lyons, Senior Vice President of the California Building Industry Association. Who would like to begin?
Good morning again. Jamil Nakvi, LAO. We can start. We'd like to just offer some brief remarks to kind of frame the discussion of this panel. We'd like to focus on the local tools, primarily local bonding capacity available. Secondly, talk about some of the limitations on local district resources on the bonding side. And third, discuss a little bit of what we know about local capacity. So first of all, local general obligation bonds have been the primary mechanism that school districts have used to construct new and modernize school facilities in California. As has been mentioned by other speakers, since the program was created in 1998, school districts have raised, at a minimum, $75.2 billion in local general obligation bonds, compared to the state's $35 billion. Now, as has already been discussed, a key component of those local revenues on the bonding side is Proposition 39, passed in 2000. Again, that lowered the vote threshold from 2/3 to 55%, and we've subsequently seen the passage rate of local bond elections increase from about 60% prior to that to an average of 80% now. And districts have certainly recognized that and used that as their primary tool, with approximately 98% of bond elections over the past years been under Proposition 39 provisions, and only 2% under the pre-existing 2/3 vote provisions. Now, there are certain limitations on the amount of debt that school districts can hold at one time and can issue, as has been discussed. The first limitation is the statutory debt ceilings, which are 1.25% of assessed value for elementary and high school districts, and 2.5% of assessed value for unified districts. These may be meaningful limits for some school districts. However, I will caveat that we do know there are a number of districts that annually seek waivers for these limits from the State Board of Education, and we know that in recent years, these limits have been routinely waived. So for some districts, they are able to exceed these limits and access more bonding capacity. Additionally, there are limitations that have been placed in statute in conjunction with Proposition 39. These are the tax rate limitations of $30 and $60 per 100,000 of assessed value. That's $30 for elementary and high school districts and $60 for unified districts. These can also be meaningful constraints on how much debt a school district can issue based on a particular bond election. As far as what we know about existing capacity, again, we know that districts have been successfully passing bonds, 75 billion and over 80% passage rates. We also know, based on an analysis done by the CDAC office within the Treasurer's office, that K through 12 school districts have approximately $30.5 billion in authorized but unissued school district bonds that have been approved between 2002 and 2013. This is out of a total of $68.1 billion that was authorized in local bonds over that period. As far as the reasons why there's so much that's outstanding, certainly one reason is that districts just haven't needed to access those bonds yet. They may not have sold the bonds because they kind of have planned their projects over a series of several years and haven't needed to access that revenue yet. That's not really a concern. What may be a concern is that some of these districts may not be able to access some of those bonds that have been approved because of these Proposition 39 limits. Some of them passed these bonds prior to the housing bust. Assessed value subsequently declined in some of these districts, and they may currently be unable to access all of those bonds that were initially authorized by voters. However, it's important to kind of note and acknowledge that Proposition 39 only limits tax rates per election. So one strategy that districts could use is to run subsequent bond elections where they can access additional bond capacity, perhaps as much as they were denied by the decline in housing values. And we have seen some indications that some districts have pursued this strategy to access additional bond authority because of declining assessed value. What we don't know at the moment is how much existing bond capacity there is and how much outstanding debt. Unfortunately, to our knowledge, there's not a current data source that tells us exactly how much outstanding debt districts have, so we don't know exactly how close most districts are to their debt ceilings. And I think that would be kind of valuable information for the legislature to consider how much local bond capacity there is. With that, if there's any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? No, we'll move on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, staff. My name is Jeff Baca, representing the California Association of School Business Officials. Our organization represents approximately 4,000 individual members as well as hundreds of local education agencies with a primary focus on school business and finance issues. So needless to say, facilities is a key priority for our members this year. And I want to begin my testimony by being transparent about what our positions are on the various issues that you've been discussing today. Number one, we do support placing an education bond on a statewide general election ballot in 2016. Second, we oppose the use of Proposition 98 funds as a source for the statewide school facilities program, and I may come back to that in a moment. And then third, we believe strongly that any new statewide school facilities program must maintain the historic partnership between the state and local districts for financing school facilities. One of the, I think, recurring themes of the testimony today is that partnership, and so I will loop back to that at the end of my testimony. I will also provide my prepared remarks to your staff following the hearing because many of the issues that I had intended to speak about have already been addressed, and I don't want to be duplicative. I did want to say that I was very impressed with the principles that were laid out by Mr. Vincent, and I would suggest to the committee that that may be an excellent yardstick by which to judge the various proposals that are before the committee today and that will be discussed over the course of the year. I also want to reinforce the point that has been made numerous times today, and that's of simplicity. Senator Liu, I think you have found a chart that is finally more complicated than how local budget approvals align with the adoption of LCAPs. And when I hear all the talk about simples, I sometimes think back to the line in the movie The Princess Bride where they say, "I do not think you know what that word means." Clearly there is work to be done on that point. I also think it's important that we not lose sight of the importance of facilities in the context of the LCFF and local control accountability plans that each LEA must prepare and now update on an annual basis. Quote unquote, school facilities being maintained in good repair is a key component of the 8 state priorities that LEAs are required to address in their LCAPs. So clearly, facilities remain a very high priority for the state. And I think it's a fair question to ask whether with that priority and expectation comes a responsibility to maintain that historic partnership. The questions outlined in your agenda really go hand to hand, political and fiscal challenges and local options. There are really, I think, fiscal challenges as well as political challenges with each of those local options. As others have stated, there is a solid recent history of school districts being able to approve general obligation bonds at the local level. In 2014, 85 of the 108 bond proposals that were on the ballot were approved for a total of $8.9 billion. So as a whole, it's safe to say that if you look at the detail within those bond proposals, it really covers the entire gamut of the issues that you're talking about today. New construction, modernization, bringing facilities up to standard, new technologies to meet with new assessments, et cetera. So that's obviously good news for districts that were able to pass a bond. But I think we can't lose sight of the fact that there are also numerous districts that have tried to pass a bond numerous times, multiple times, and have failed in their efforts to do so. And you only need to look as close as Woodland Unified School District, which had a pretty significant proposal on the ballot last November, and I think received somewhere in the neighborhood of 43%. So it's not universal, that rate of passage. I won't go through the bonded indebtedness limits and the tax rate limits that were adopted as part of Proposition 39 in the year 2000, but I do want to make a couple of comments about those. With respect to the waivers being granted by the State Board of Education, based on the data that I looked at, going through the annual waiver reports from 2009 to 13, and then looking at some data that Department of Education was able to provide, it appears that there were roughly 40 of those waivers approved between the year 2000 and the year 2013, but 10 of those were in 2013 alone. And I think that it's only anecdotal, but it may indicate a trend of more districts going to the state board to waive those limits. And getting at something that Mr. Vincent spoke about, those limits come into play as a challenge for school districts because the research has shown that disparities in school facilities funding across the state are systematically related to the assessed value of property within those districts. So if you're a school district, for example, Senator Block, you made reference to winners and losers within your own region. If you're a school district in areas of the state that have had very low assessed valuation increases or even decreases during the Great Recession, Riverside County, many rural areas, then even if you're able to pass bonds in those communities, you may have issues generating the amount of funds that you need in order to, for example, replace temporary classrooms with new construction. And then I almost hesitate to bring this up, but bond capacity has led to some other issues. I think Senator Lieu and Senator Block, you'll both recall legislation that came through the Senate Education Committee in 2013 that was authored by Assemblymember Joan Buchanan on the use of capital appreciation bonds. Now, there was a reason that districts were using capital appreciation bonds as a tool in order to maximize the amount of funding that they could receive in order to meet the needs and the desires of their community and the needs of their master plan. But obviously, the long-term debt that was resulting from some of those issuances was becoming an issue both for local and statewide decision makers. And so now we do have statutory restrictions on the use of that tool, which I think many districts were using in what people would agree was a responsible manner. There are some other options that school districts can use beyond general obligation bonds, but I think that those come with challenges as well. There are certificates of participation or COPs, which is a way similar to using lease financing for roughly the same purposes of a general obligation bond. Sometimes those look very much like a GO bond, and other times they're used for smaller projects or purchases up to and including the construction of a new school. COPS do not require voter approval, but they carry a certain amount, perhaps significant risk, in that the debt is serviced through allocations in the district's general fund. So this is a fiscal challenge because the last thing that any chief business official wants to do is put his or her general fund at risk. And I think a political challenge as well, because I know from talking to many members and staff in the Capitol that there have been many issues and a good amount of skepticism about the use of COPS as a primary tool to finance school facilities. There are also bond anticipation notes or bands, which in its simplest form is a way to provide bridge financing for facilities in the short term when, as the name implies, it's anticipated that a district will issue bonds at some time in the near future. Those instruments are limited to terms of 5 years, but also carry risk in that it's never easy to predict the future. And if your bridge financing turns out to be a bridge to nowhere, then you've got a problem on your hands. There are lesser known, not frequently used tools, grant anticipation notes, which are dependent on a future source of revenue, tax revenue anticipation notes, which are more commonly used for cash flow issues, but there are also examples of using those to finance facilities improvements and constructions. And then, of course, a school district can also choose to establish a community facilities district under the Mello-Roos Act or a school facilities improvement district. Those bonds issued in those districts are a flat special tax on property owners within, in the case of the community facilities district, on property owners and on taxpayers within the school facilities improvement district. One risk that was associated with the CFDs during the period of the recession was the risk of default. And I've been told that at one time that the delinquency rate or the delinquent rate on those was actually 1 in 10 was in jeopardy of being in default. So again, there are options. If someone were to ask me, which they don't frequently do, I would probably caution the use of any of those other debt instruments. But I think at the end of the day, when we're talking about what's the message to take out of all this, it's to reinforce what I said at the beginning, which is that the state and local partnership is really the key to the program's success. Now, we haven't had a lot of time to absorb and think about the legislative analyst's recommendation, but I do think that we have a fundamental disagreement with even the potential use of Proposition 98 funds for school facilities. To me, it would just seem to exacerbate the adequacy conversations that we're already having. And I can't remember, I think it was Mr. Vincent who said another key threshold question really for the committee and the legislature is debt. Bad thing, good thing, somewhere in between. I think we would argue that there's nothing irresponsible. There's always exceptions that prove the rule, but nothing irresponsible in the issuance of debt. And again, we simply are strong supporters of maintaining that state and local partnership. Thank you.